Okay, great. Well, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining us on this lovely Friday afternoon. I'm looking out and it's nice and sunny in Humboldt, so that feels good. I think I know many of you, but I'm Lania and I'm the director of the ANR Fire Network and based up in Arcata. And we are excited today to have our new fire advisor for Humboldt and Del Norte counties here to share with us. Just a reminder, these fire breaks are really intended for us to get to know each other and to kind of link up and understand what work people are doing within ANR and who's doing what, and maybe foster some new collaboration or new conversation among different parts of ANR's teams who work on fire. So Cleo Woelfle Hazard is our new fire advisor in Humboldt and Del Norte counties, started in January, and I'm super excited. He brings a lot of kind of new perspective and expertise to our team, to our fire advisor team. And of course, it's kind of fun because I'm still based here in Humboldt. So when Cleo moves down here fully, we'll get to work a lot together and be in the same office, and just super excited to have him join us. So today he will be sharing some of his work from out actually in the mid-Klamath. He comes to us from the University of Washington, where he was a professor for many years, but has done a lot of work in the Klamath Mountains. And so, yeah, I'm going to pass it off to you, Cleo, and you can get us started. So we'll have time, we'll have the presentation, and then we'll have time at the end for a lot of questions and discussion and getting to know each other. And we'll try to keep on track for ending around 12:45.
Okay, great. So thanks so much, Katie, for organizing, and Lenia for the introduction. And yeah, it's great to see familiar faces and new faces. So I'm going to talk today about fire and water, underflows and fieldwork, spatial science, and community-led research. And just since I'm new to the network, I wanted to do a little bit of introduction on me and my work and how I bring fire and water together. And so just to begin with this photograph, this is from Tishániik, which is a Karuk village and ceremonial center located just downriver from Orleans, California, in the Klamath River Basin. And so you can see the river on the right, and then you can see some beneficial fire on the left. So this is a place where Karuk people have always burned, but in the last, since 2015, when they regained title to this piece of property, they've been really introducing a lot of good fire here multiple times per year, including summer burns, which are really effective at suppressing blackberry, among other things. So yeah, so this is just kind of by way of grounding in place. I did want to acknowledge the Karuk people who have welcomed me to their ancestral territory, which you can see here outlined in yellow. And this is kind of where I'll be talking about today. My main principal investigators, co-PIs on this work are Lisa Moorhead-Hillman, who's a basket weaver and educator, and Leif Hillman, who's a cultural practitioner and ceremonial leader there. And so we've been working since around 2018 on revitalizing intergenerational learning and river reconnection, and are now branching out into fire and climate modeling, which is what I'm going to talk about today. And then, as Lenia mentioned, I'm currently kind of splitting my time between Seattle, where I was, and where my kid is finishing first grade, and Eureka, where I'm excited to be located full-time. So I just wanted to also acknowledge the Duwamish and Muckleshoot and Squamish people in Seattle, where I have been working, and then the Wiyat people in Eureka. I wanted to just give a little bit more sense of some of the firework that's going on the ground here. So this is some good fire in a coppice willow stand at Tishániik that's maintained by basket weavers during a summer burn, a June burn, that the Karuk tribe and Forest Service collaborated on. And so a lot of the firework at the site is motivated by different basketry plants like willows. And so these plants are cultivated by basket weavers using fire, but also by being mindful of river flooding. And so a lot of this research that we're doing is looking at flooding and fire as disturbance that creates particular conditions in these plants that are conducive to basketry. And so you can see here we're harvesting willow roots from sandbars. And so if you have sandbars, then the willow can grow long and straight and strong. If you have a lot of cobble, it gets all twisted. And so there's not a lot of sand bars in this area because of partly because of dams, but mostly just because the river's been confined by a levee. And so part of the work that we're doing is to kind of think about centering river restoration in the needs of cultural practitioners, and also this kind of intersection between fire and water. And so here's Lisa with a cap that she's made from a bunch of different fire dependent and flood dependent plants. So there's about 10 different species of plants there, including black fern and willow and alder and pine root. And so she uses this to show how in order to practice culture by weaving a cap or wearing a cap at a ceremony, you need to have all of these different processes alive and well on the landscape. And so this is a just kind of like a holistic way of expressing kind of the kind of understanding of the role of fire and also water in this project. And so the name of this project in Karuk is called Pishkish Yav Umusahish, which means the river will look good. And so we do a lot of, in addition to the scientific work, we do a lot of thinking about the river as a being, the river as an entity. What does justice look like for a river, and how do we know if the river is looking good? This is situated within a Karuk cultural context, and so that's kind of an introduction to the place that I'm going to be talking about. And then I just briefly wanted to do a little plug for, let's see, this isn't gonna look good. Oh man, because I don't clean up my slides. Okay, so I'm here in Minneapolis doing a seminar about my book Underflows, which is subtitled Queer Trans Ecologies and River Justice. And so this book is in the fields of feminist science studies and indigenous studies and also in queer and trans theory. And so I won't talk about it too much, but I'm happy to talk about it in the question and answer. It began during my training, at UC Berkeley in aquatic ecology, and is partly kind of reflection on that process of being trained into the sciences and how incorporating notions of queer kinship or trans species relations could deepen our perspectives as ecologists and allow us to come up with also new policy and kind of political framings for the work of revitalizing rivers. And yeah, I think that's all I'll say about that right now. So I want to talk a little bit about the way that I approach research and also extension work. One of the reasons I was really excited to come to extension is that this is a place where community-led research and kind of co-creation of knowledge with various clients and tribes is really all understood. And so I don't think this will be new to anyone, but I just wanted to share a little bit of the work that I've done to kind of theorize around why community-led research, how it can work, and what are some of those things that make it work differently than mainstream science. And so this is a figure from a paper that my students and I wrote for a special issue of American Naturalist on feminist science studies methods. And so this is a depiction of the research cycle. In the paper, we also show the normal kind of scientific process where you have some of these elements, but not all of them. But in this cycle, there's always a lot of relationship building, some clarity on intention, and then an invitation from a partner, or if I'm making the invitation, consent, right, to undertake this process of research co-design. In this process, there's a lot of listening, reciprocity, sharing of resources, relationship building, co-generation of knowledge. And then we have a research question, we get the funding, we go out and gather the data, And then as we're analyzing that data, we're trying to make sure that this is non-extractive, that there's protocols for data sovereignty in place, that it's transparent. And then as we move into reflecting and discussing on, well, what does this mean? How can we interpret these data in light of different knowledge systems, Western and otherwise? It's really important to think about our own positionality, so our own life histories and training and institutional affiliations, how these might affect what we see in that data and what we think it means. And then in sharing and evaluating that data or that project, trying to think about serving community and next steps. And so I just wanted to briefly go through an example that some of my students put together on this river reconnection project at Tishániik to give a little example of how this might look. And so these are some of my students who put this together. So there are 3 landscape architecture students and a forestry student who are working on a project to reconnect the river at Tishániik. And so you can see some of the archival sources we were looking at. We brought these to the field, to the place, and we're working here with Lisa and Leif Hillman to understand, how the surface of the land has changed, going to some different restoration sites, collecting some data on some Indian potatoes that they thought would be helpful to know more about. The students went back, they made their preliminary designs, they came back with those designs again to this little camp table at Tishániik. You can see there's a lot of annotating and marking up and critique and rejection of different ideas. Lisa and Leif also thought it was really important that the families that are associated with this place get out on the river. So we organized some rafting trips, some different workshops to coppice those willows that you saw burning before. We built some 3D models and and then did some workshops for youth interns on different methods from landscape architecture to kind of orient them to this field as a field that they might want to pursue. And then from this report back, we iterated on these conceptual designs. There's also some reciprocity, again, returning to help on the burn, doing some different surveys of beavers and the bathymetry of the river. And then at the request of the tribe, put together 2 different products that were more public facing to explain both the process that we were undertaking and the goal of reconnecting the river. And so there was a 6-page report for the Army Corps of Engineers, who obviously needs to approve any demolition of this levee. And then there's also a story map called Coyote's Journey, which I'm happy to share, that really situates this whole design project within the Karuk story of Coyote and kind of explaining from a cultural perspective why it might be important to reconnect the river in this way. And so throughout this process, we've been working within the Karuk review board, which is called the Pikyav, practicing Pikyav. Pikyav means to fix it in Karuk. And so there's a lot of different elements to this. There's about 23 different points in their kind of memorandum, but just to summarize some of them, our approach emphasizes indigenous-led experimentation and dialogue, place-based practices of care undertaken by our scientists, designers, and cultural practitioners through our daily work. Some of these practices include respect of knowledge keepers, centering indigenous knowledge, power sharing and tribal engagement, the political economy of research, research with a purpose, epistemic diversity, tribal oversight, listening, transparency, patience, and giving back to the Karuk community. So with that background on kind of how we went about conducting this research, I wanted to present a little bit more on one of our newer projects that's still in process on climate science in the Klamath Basin as a whole. So this project is funded by the National Center for Atmospheric Research, or NCAR, through the Early Career Innovators Program. So this is where they have cohorts of social scientists who are leading teams of climate modelers to make their climate models more relevant or their modeling products. And so it's also a partnership with the Karuk tribe and the Western Klamath Restoration Partnership. So The idea behind this project is that fire affects water. And so the fire regime in a given place can affect summer stream flow, stream temperature, scouring floods, debris flows, which are these landslides, like muddy landslides that you get after intense fires. And these all matter for the river and for the Karuk people because the floodplain and the river host a number of ecocultural plants, fishes. People go there and practice culture and ceremony in different ways, as well as deer and elk, riverine animals, native birds, and the river itself. So just for an example of how this works hydrologically, so my undergraduate work is in hydrology and fluvial geomorphology. So I'm really interested in, just measuring stream flow and stream gauges and what can we see about the effects of fire. So this is the Slater fire. You can see on the left a photograph of the fire kind of barreling toward the town of Happy Camp on September 8th, 2020. And then you can see some of the aftermath of this fire. It's this very high severity fire across much of the landscape. And what you can't really tell here, but this little line right here is Indian Creek. And so the fire burned almost the entire watershed of Indian Creek, which is a tributary to the Klamath River. And so this gives us a chance to really look at the hydrologic signal of this fire and this stream gauge. So this is a USGS stream gauge for Happy Camp. And so you can't really see, but this is just over September 8th, 9th, 10th through 15th. And then this is the discharging cubic feet per second. And so this is basically the amount of water that's in the stream. And you can see a few things on this. So before the fire, you can see this diurnal cycle. So during the nighttime, as the trees along the stream are not transpiring, the stream actually rises. And then in the daytime, when they are transpiring, the level of the water drops because they're sucking up that water. And this is called the riparian pump effect. And then you can see that when this fire happened right at this point, and then you can see this lag. So you can see the river stream flow increasing slowly as that extra water that wasn't being transpired by the trees is trickling down from the headwaters and eventually getting down to Indian Creek. And then the following summer, you can see this riparian pump effect resuming as some of the oaks start sprouting back and some of the kind of understory starts coming in. And so thinking more broadly about this phenomenon of, there's a lot of extra trees in the Klamath Basin. There's a lot of fir plantations, a century of fire suppression that is pumping a lot of this water that otherwise would be reaching the stream in the summer. And so thinking in a big picture, Lee Philman, the co-PI in this project, had this question, right? Well, how much would maximum prescribed fire policy affect wildfire risk and stream flow? And we ended up honing in on 2050 and 2100 as these two places where we could snapshot what that might look like given different future climate projections. And I'll talk more about why we chose those years in a little while. So questions that we can ask this model, which I'll tell you a little bit more about the model in a second. How will fire weather change over the 21st century? How will prescribed burning change future wildfire behavior? And how do different fire regimes affect future stream flow? And so the model that we're using is called CESM, the Community Earth System Modeling, and then we're using a land model called the Community Land Model. This is generally run for the whole Earth. It's the model that's used on the IPCC analyses, and usually it has grid cells of 250 square kilometers. So we're scaling that down to 1 square kilometer, and that challenges and in some cases breaks aspects of the model. So in this applying a global model to a local area, we have an issue with the fire models. So their fire model doesn't have any fire spread. That might make sense over this 250 square kilometer range, but certainly doesn't make sense over 1 square kilometer. There's no modeling of stream temperature processing. There's no groundwater flow. So like all models, this model has its limitations that we have to either work within or, build new model components. So just for those of you who aren't familiar with the intricacies of climate models, this land and river model has three elements: a climate model, land cover, and then a soil as inputs. The land cover being vegetation. So that goes into inside of the land model, that goes into the land model, and then that land model generates runoff, so stream flow, or evapotranspiration. And then some of that water might go into soil moisture. There's also a snow model, and then there's various heat fluxes that are kind of affecting how much runoff is generated and when the snow is melting. And then there's a river model that gives you an output of river discharge or stream flow. And so the climate model is going to force precipitation, temperature, wind, and other radiative fluxes, things like that. And so you can see what some of this looks like over our area. So precipitation, air temperature, long wave radiation, solar radiation, humidity, and wind speed. And so this is just an idea of what some of those inputs look like. One issue is that the climate grid cells are much larger than the surface cells. And so the surface data set is only 1 square kilometer. You can see what that looks like here. And then these are what the climate grid cells are. So we're working at downscaling the climate model as well, but these scale mismatches can also create some issues. The river model routes runoff through a stream network. And again, there's issues of scale. We ended up going with this very fine scale watershed-based river network. This is what the river network looks like at that larger scale. And then the land model is essentially growing plants in grid cells. And so each of these grid cells is a mix of different land covers, so that are fairly coarse, as I'll get into later on, but you can have vegetation, you can have lake, you can have urban, you can have a crop. And then within that vegetated, you have different soil and kind of patch dynamics. And then there's crop models that you can use. And so running this land model at this downscaled 1 kilometer grid cell to look at some of the historical simulations, this figure is showing the change during the period from 2000 to 2020 compared to 1961 to 1980. So again, using historical data between this, mid-century and early 21st century, we're seeing decrease in precipitation, increase in evapotranspiration, decrease in runoff, and a decrease in the seasonal peak snow. So this is also what we're observing, in the real world. So this is a good indication that the model is working, at least in the historical period. And so then we did some evaluation of the river model, the same thing. And again, we're seeing this discharge in decrease in winter and spring, slight increase in summer. And this is because of the snow is melting more faster and having rain on snow. And then again, discharging, decreasing in the fall. So again, this is similar to what we're observing, in real time. And so then to make the land model inputs for the future land cover surface, we held a series of workshops in Tishániik in Orleans to solicit both Karuk and local knowledge about what the land cover might look like in 2050 and 2100, especially if people were able to scale up prescribed burning and cultural burning in the way that they would like to. And so here you can see a cultural practitioner, Kathy McCovey, and a hydrologist, Eli Asarian, and another cultural practitioner, Nick Hillman, who are looking at the extent of meadows from a 1944 aerial and telling a lot of stories about exactly what each meadow used to look like and how they might how they've evolved since then with encroachment of Douglas firs and things like that. So from these workshop inputs, we created this maximum prescribed fire layer for 2050. And so from interviews and this workshop, people said we should create, they're already doing what WKRP is already doing a number of projects to create buffers around towns. They would like to be able to re-enter wildfire scars with good fire within 10 years to keep them from converting to shrublands, essentially. And so this map is, largely building on planned projects, but also extrapolating a little bit into some areas where we think that there will be wildfire and then opportunity to do some more managed fire, prescribed fire in these wildfire scars beyond these project areas. And so these are maps that communities can use to plan prescribed and cultural burning on more of a landscape scale. And then for the 2100s, don't worry too much about the legend. These are just different vegetation communities. And so for the 2050s, I just showed you a close-up of that. For the 2100s, we relied on this pattern of Karuk cultural burning from the pre-colonial, pre-contact times, where they would burn. So you can see in this yellow, this represents the first ridge line up to the river. So this was a fine-grained mosaic. It was the women's domain of burning. They would burn intensively around villages for like roots and shoots, food and basketry and medicine crops. And then from approximately like a 2-mile buffer out from that in this pink area, was the men's domain. They were burning along trails for hunting. It created a more coarse-grained mosaic. And then you can see on here, this is the kind of the happy camp wildland urban interface, and then up in this Salmon River also. So we kind of applied this model rather than applying it to where the historical villages were. We applied it to kind of current settlements to say, okay, what would it look like if we could burn in this way where the settlements are protected and then you can have managed wildfire in all of these kind of green areas. So just to kind of bring this back into that framework that I was showing at the beginning. So these workshops where you can see we brought these climate modelers from Colorado to Orleans and got a lot of feedback on the model saying, okay, your fire model is crap. We don't want it. It's not going to work for us. And this is where we got this idea to do these 2050 and 2100 land cover scenarios that had the added benefit of being useful in planning for scaling up prescribed fire right now. And yeah, through this relationship building, we've also gone on to think of other projects that we could do together, including some analyses of future fire weather that I'll talk about at the end if I have time. And so some of the challenges, with fire modeling in CTSM, the communities are interested in fires and ecological force, fire intensity, fire spread. The fire models are probabilistic. They kind of say a whole grid cell is either burned or unburned with no spread. So that's kind of why we went this other approach. Another limitation is that going back to the way that plants are rendered or vegetation is rendered, there's these 17 different plant functional types that are used across the whole globe. So any plant that you have to kind of shoehorn it into one of these plant functional types. And the way that climate modelers see plants is they're basically just kind of flat surfaces that transpire. There's like a leaf area index that is, releasing carbon dioxide and water to the atmosphere. And so we did our best to put all of the different plants in the Karuk Aboriginal territory into these slots, which are the ones that are relevant. But there's also these 9 other slots that could potentially be used for cultural focal species. So just for an example of kind of what this process looked like. So Karuk tribe, like many kind of tribes that work with federal agencies, use this land fire biophysical setting kind of plant classification scheme. And so what we did was try to convert the BPS, this biophysical setting, into plant functional types. So one of these biophysical settings is called Klamath River lower montane serpentine mixed conifer woodland. And this is how it kind of shapes up as best we could estimate in terms of percentages of these different plant functional types. And these are some of the species that are there. And so, you know, it's one of these areas where there's just a really different understanding of what a plant is and what is important about a plant. And so this is an area where we think that there's maybe some room to differentiate between, like say within this needle leaf evergreen type, between a Douglas fir, particularly Douglas fir plantation, and a species like a sugar pine, which is, you know, culturally important for various reasons. So this is some future work that we're hoping to do with this model.
Hey, Cleo, I just wanted to do a quick time check. Because I want to make sure people have time to ask you a couple questions. So
Okay.
maybe just a couple more minutes and then.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah,
Okay.
I'll be done in like 5 minutes. Is that good? Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So so I could talk more about the model and what it can do. You know, in essence, we can run these different experiments on it, looking at original land cover and post-fire land cover under the historical climate conditions, the mid-20th century and the late mid-21st century and late 21st century. And so far we've done this part of it. And, you know, just to show, looking at the Salmon River, we can see, and, you know, there's these different ensemble members. The yellow ones are, the blue ones are the baseline and the land cover, and then the other ones are with future climate and also with the kind of meteorological spread that you get. And I can go into more detail about this later. But essentially what you're seeing, so this line along 0 is the baseline flow. And then this blue is if you change the land cover. So this is the maximum prescribed fire scenario. So reducing the amount of essentially dead fir that are transpiring. And so this is flow here on this axis, and then January through December on this axis. And so you can see that you're getting some increase, you know, in stream flow from these modifications to the land cover. And then you can see there's a lot more variability, right, among these different climate model ensemble members, and how that stream flow is going to vary in the future. And I can talk more about that later. So there's some future work that we could do on this model. One area that I'm really interested in focusing on is these high elevation meadows. You can see here a photo that Nick Hillman took of one of these ones that we were talking about on this map. Yeah, I can talk more about the future of the kind of fire weather, and both predictions of extreme fire weather days, but also there's some new burn windows that might be really exciting for beneficial fire that we can start to look at with this model. So with that, I will wrap it up, and really happy to take any questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Cleo. Sorry to shorten your.
No, you didn't. That's perfect.
Cool. Well, do people have questions for Cleo? I could start us with a question oh, good. No, Max has a question. Yeah, Max.
I do.
Maybe will you stop sharing your screen, and that way we can see each other?
Oh yeah, that's awesome. That's not a very interesting.
Perfect. There we go.
Cool stuff. Cool stuff, Cleo. Thank you.
Yeah.
I've always been intrigued by that idea of the water and fire, the riparian pump. The dynamics that you showed, and to actually see it is really pretty cool. What I was wondering though is, you know, if a landscape scale fire happens and it leaves the riparian area largely intact, does that really diminish the potential effect on the riparian, on altering the riparian pump? I mean, the word riparian implies that it's kind of due to the riparian vegetation, but it's probably goes beyond.
Yeah,
right?
I think it's a mix, you know, because I think you see in that lag time with the flows coming back up. I think if it was only the riparian, it wouldn't have taken, you know, day and a half for it to come back up. But I think that's a really interesting question. It would be really cool to do there are areas, like I remember in the Methal in 2014, they did have these areas where they had actually reintroduced beavers. And so there were all these beaver dams and essentially kept the riparian from burning, where the whole rest of the landscape was totally torched. So you could imagine if you had a scenario like that where the riparian didn't burn, that you could maybe look at that if you had enough
Yeah,
gauge.
yeah. Okay.
Yeah, great question though. I think, and there is actually a study that, yeah, one of those kind of planned implementation areas that is going to be burned pretty soon. There is a stream in there where the Karuk tribe is interested in doing that kind of an experiment and getting some stream gauges in, or at least pressure transducers in a few years, and then yeah, burn at different intensities and see how that changes. There are some other, I have heard, and if anyone has heard of other sources, as I mentioned this to people, I've heard of other places where there happen to be, groundwater monitoring or stream monitoring, and then the whole thing burned. And so there is some of that data of what that effect is. So yeah. Heather?
First off, welcome and congratulations on your amazing work that you're doing. How exciting. So welcome. And I was just kind of wondering how you go about using data sovereignty with the indigenous communities, because that's of special interest to me.
Yeah, so I mean, I think first and foremost, we always just try to understand like what are the concerns that are what are the data that are sensitive and aren't sensitive, and that's always going to be tribally specific. For example, with the Karuk tribe, like things like stream temperature data, they don't consider to be sensitive, and that's all just on the internet. But other tribes, I was talking to someone here in Minneapolis yesterday where they're measuring the lake levels for manumin, for wild rice, and that lake level data was considered, culturally important and not to be shared. And so you shouldn't assume, that something is or isn't. And then once what is the knowledge that people don't want shared, then there's various ways to go about that. For example, like I'd say probably most tribes would say that locations of particular archaeological sites or village sites or cemeteries, like that's all sensitive and shouldn't be put on a map. And so when we were thinking about how to make this pattern of burning around the villages, at first we were going to use the historic villages because we wanted to produce a layer of like 1850 vegetation. And so then we had to put the village points in there, create a buffer around them, erase the village points, and then see, well, could you still tell where the village was, right? And if you couldn't, then that would be fine. Like sometimes you can't because there's so much heterogeneity in the vegetation anyway. But if you could, then you might need to like zoom out or share that at a scale where it wouldn't be possible. So I think, that's often kind of an iterative process. And I think there's connected to data sovereignty, there's also tribal benefit as a principle, and just how you never exactly know how people are going to use your data. And I think in Western science, like we're so used to, data should be free, data should be for everyone. And I was just talking with some collaborators today about this new proposal to with NASA to look at future fire conditions and maybe things like smoke. And a collaborator was saying, well, we don't necessarily want to do this if it's just going to mean that people who live on the coast who are coming to their second homes inland are using this tool to decide, to raise their property values or whatever. And so in that case, it was appropriate to say, well, this isn't going to be a public facing tool. This is just going to be for the tribe, and they could decide to share it with other tribes. So, that's some of my experiences. I think, yeah, I think I've learned just to not make assumptions about what might or might not be culturally sensitive or what people might or might not want to be shared.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Did you have a question, Lania? I know you had one before.
Oh, yeah, I guess we could wrap up. I do want to respect people's time, but the question I had was just about the Western Klamath Restoration Partnership and some of that ongoing work that's happening and how you're modeling ties into the larger landscape scale plans that they've all been putting together.
Yeah, so we definitely used all those plans as inputs. And then, you know, in interviews with some of the people who are most involved in that, you know, we're trying to take some of the patterns that they've noticed in particular places and then think about where they might apply in other places. And so things like, you know, serpentine, soils, early effects, you know, plants that are growing, or things like landslides. So, yeah, we're hoping to, yeah, that this will be useful in, you know, helping to plan in those areas where they're not yet planning, and especially in the kind of the managed wildfire, you know, just looking at the areas that haven't burned since 1990 and assuming that those are going to burn again by 2050, and then, okay, how can we plan for those places going forward?
Awesome. Great. Well, I think with that, we'll close it out so people can kind of finish up their lunch and get back to their days. But I want to give a huge thanks to Cleo for giving this talk, and we will post the recording on the Fire Network YouTube page, so you can find it there and share it if you want to. I also wanted to let you know that our next fire break will be on May 20th from noon to 12:45, and we'll have livestock advisor Tracy Shore on, and also I might mess up this name, but Dr. Lais Costa from UC Davis School of Veterinary Medicine, who's going to talk about some of the fire-related work that they're doing. So I think that should be a really cool set of talks, and I hope you all will join us. So thanks, Katie, for pulling this together, and thanks again, Cleo, and I hope you all have a great weekend.